Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of March 8th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, who is Research Director for the very same Texas Politics Project. On the front burner today, we have, not for the first time, immigration and border security. Governor Abbott was in Mission today, did one of numerous press events he's done, and maybe we'll touch on perhaps some of the rationale for doing multiple events around the state a little later in the podcast. But I thought today, with immigration and border security on the front line for a couple of years, Josh and I would talk a little bit about all of this. And Josh, you and I have been writing something that should come out pretty soon, should we get the time to actually finish it, on immigration and border security and its perennial presence on the UT Texas Tribune poll. And in a way, I don't want to overstate the degree to which this is true. The COVID pandemic, I don't know what the right verb is, and I think we've crossed it out in different ways in the piece we're writing, masked, sublimated, suppressed the prominence of immigration and border security in the ways that it shows up in the poll, particularly in the salience items, but it's kind of on the way back, it seems to me, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. That is a tough verb to choose. I was going to say, can you suppress a preoccupation? That's really kind of, I think,
Freud would say that's the basis of Western civilization.
Well, okay, this is getting beyond my expertise. Let's bring it back to immigration. But that's right. So, I think the thing that I think people should know as a starting point here is that immigration and border security have been, continue to, and remain a priority issue in Texas, and in particular among Republicans. And to the extent, it's an interesting way you set that up. And to the extent that COVID has masked that, I think what it's done is, it's probably taken up, most of, I don't want to say this, I have a bad analogy. I want to say it's taken up most of the oxygen, but it's taken up a lot of the bandwidth of most press coverage, really, of everything. COVID and its economic impact, gender dynamics, racial dynamics, the hospital system, et cetera, et cetera. There's a COVID impact on schools, on prisons, on policing. So it's sort of hard not to talk about COVID. It's even hard not to talk about COVID in the immigration space, I think. Even prior to sort of the most recent influx of migrants, there was talk in the last year or so about, what about immigrants in detention facilities? What's going on there to make sure that these aren't, going out of control? But again, it could have been anywhere else. But the subtext of all this is the fact that immigration and border security remained throughout the last year of the pandemic as a priority issue for Republicans in particular.
Yeah, and it's been, it's funny. I think when we talk about this, in a lot of ways, as you were talking about it, we sort of migrated immediately to media coverage, which gets to the underlying, some of the underlying theories of public opinion and what shapes it, and elite cues and media cues. And I guess it's funny, you can kind of talk about it being, when you talk about it being masked, I think it lends itself to framing it conceptualizing it in terms of the media coverage and elite discussion. And, I think you're right to point out that a lot of the COVID coverage in which everybody, media outlets have understandably and justifiably kind of flooded the zone lends itself to, the coverage, to stories and to news stories and coverage about COVID and X, Y, Z. And immigration and border security have, entered into that. But then there's also the more cognitive, attitudinal sort of piece of this, which you then I think you were getting to, which is where it shows up in the polling, right? Mm-hmm. And how it appears and disappears and what the function, where that comes from.
Right. No, when you say appears and disappears, do you mean in the polling or in the attitudes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right.
In our measurements of that attitudinal cognitive space, or the best measurements we can muster.
Well, and it's funny. Just to draw the curtain back for a second. As a public pollster in Texas who's regularly assessing attitudes, we essentially have to have a conversation on almost every single public poll about whether and what immigration items we are going to include on this poll.
Right.
Because ultimately, really, you can't go that long without it coming up. I mean, as the current discussion makes clear. Now, there's reasons it's come up. Again, there's, a huge crush of especially unaccompanied minors, straining the border, the immigration system at the border right now. And that is a real policy issue that is salient. But the reality is it doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't really, but it doesn't. It doesn't really matter in time whether immigration is up or immigration is down. It doesn't really matter whether the state just spent a bunch of money on border security or the federal government just spent a bunch of border security or not. It still remains an issue. So, I mean, in the poll we just released, taken in February, 23% of Texans said that COVID was the most important issue facing Texas. 25% of Texans said it was immigration and border security combined. So ultimately, it's, if you just take a step back, even just looking at Texas as a whole, this is an issue that is competitive for attention with COVID as the most important issue facing the state. And that's the starting point to understand this, I think. And then the next piece is that it's driven overwhelmingly by Republicans. So, basically, 13% of Republicans say that COVID is the most important issue facing the state. 46% say it's immigration or border security. So nearly half of Republicans say this is the issue. This is the issue that the state needs to deal with. And this is true pretty much all the time. I mean, that's sort of the interesting thing. It didn't matter when Obama was Obama's president. He's apparently not dealing with immigration, effectively enough. It's the most important issue. Donald Trump becomes president and he's going after the issue, repeatedly. It's still the most important issue.
Yeah, the context changes a little, and yet that the salience remains remarkably persistent. And then and I don't have all the data right in front of me, but my memory is that the high point of the Republican salience of immigration prior to COVID, it's routinely when we break out that the numbers you just talked about, it's routinely in the low to mid 50s. I think the high point it may have hit 60.
Yeah, around one of the
during one of the crises. But it dropped. I think it dropped down into the 30s at the height of the pandemic.
Maybe early on, right?
Yeah, but early. I think probably April and June it ticked down among Republicans, and so it's hard. And we'll have to. We should probably produce a graphic on this at some point. And
I was thinking about this morning. That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like. If we're up at 46 right now, given what's going on in the news and going on in the world, we're on the way back. And so let's talk a little bit then about, the politics of this. So Greg Abbott was in Mission this morning. Is that what we decided? Yeah.
Mission, Texas.
In Mission, Texas. Did one of a series of recent media availabilities in which he talked about things other than the recent blackouts and other than COVID for that matter, unless he was ending the shutdown order and masking, which was, the big event last week, which we talked about in the podcast.
Right. Mission accomplished.
But he had a lot of surrounding actors from, I believe, from DPS, from the Border Patrol, underlining the degree to which this is a crisis in which Texas is responding. And this comes amidst, a certain amount of criticism, which I'm sure that they think is unfair, that the Abbott team thinks is unfair, that the governor is engaging in, at best, redirection, at worst, misdirection in the wake of other crises in the state. I mean, I think it was in the Houston Chronicle.
Yeah.
Ran a, kind of a big think piece that was organized around the fact that there were plenty of people willing to say this. Now, one can think that's true, but also realize that stories like that are largely built on messaging from the governor's political opponents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Well, and I think, when you're mentioning whether it's redirection, or not, I mean, one of the things I think, in terms of discussing, I don't think it's not just about the fact that the governor is showing that Texas is responding to this, what is clearly a crisis, but again, a perpetual crisis, just to set that aside. I mean, both in people's perception and also in terms of, dealing with the spring surges of migrants who come to the border and our inability to deal with it. So first and foremost, yes, right. Texas is responding to it, but the other big message there is, and the federal government is not.
Right. And so, that's exactly right. So the governor spent a lot of time, to your point, in, what I saw of the press conference today, which was most, though not all of it, placing the blame for this at the, squarely at the feet of the Biden administration. Now, I think
a month and a half into the job, just like,
we've been saying, for weeks that we should anticipate this, if not for months. And, it's arrived in full throat. And by this, I mean the use of the federal government as a foil and the Biden administration as a foil for problems that are being experienced at the state level. But, the messaging from the governor was pretty direct and, hit multiple points. I mean, he blamed you were talking about the regularity of the spring surge, but he blamed the magnitude of the surge, quote unquote, because of the new policies of the Biden administration. Now, there's a grain of truth in that. I mean,
Sure.
To the extent that, there seems to be ample evidence that, potential migrants, get word of what's happening in the United States, and the flows are to some degree influenced by what we used to call pull factors in immigration. That is, things about what's going on in the United States that increase the flow of migrants or immigrants from origin countries. And it does seem like that is the fact, and that the Biden administration sent clear signals that they were not going to be as restrictive and were going to engage in more humanitarian policies than the Trump administration. And there does seem to be evidence that the flows of folks, are increasing, and we can see those numbers. And the governor made a point of providing data. I've not confirmed this. He said that there were, there had been. He said somebody showed him data today while he was at the border, just to give
I don't like
full
the sound
context.
of that.
Yeah, that said that there were 108,000. There had been 108,000 migrants, this year after, and I'm not sure if those are apprehensions or detentions, after only 90 odd thousand in the entirety of last year. Now, we'll see if those numbers hold up in some fact checking. But I think the broad situation is true. There is a big influx of people brewing, and it is a problem for the Biden administration, having had Democrats through the duration of the Trump administration criticize how the Trump administration handled this problem, including, the inhumane policies at the border, including separation of families. The Biden administration now has to handle the problem. And it does raise the issue that this was a problem for the Obama administration, as some defenders of the Trump administration pointed out that, and again, there was some redirection here, but again, something to it that it's not as if the Obama administration solved this problem and then the Trump administration arrived and screwed it up.
Well, I think, but that's like, I mean, this is sort of unimportant for this conversation, but I just feel like saying it anyway.
I'm saying it anyway.
I'm going to say it anyway, which is, this is the difficulty. I mean, this is one of the difficulties with this issue, right? Is that, and it's kind of, I can make analogies here, but I'll just make it straightforward, which is there's a certain amount of migrant flow that's going to happen no matter what, period, right? That's just because of the fact that, there are structural factors in the countries people are coming from in the United States that have nothing to do with immigration policy or who isn't, or which administration is in place. They're going to draw some baseline number of people to this country every cycle, every year, or whatever. It could change based on, conditions in their own country. But ultimately, like I would guess, and again, I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm making a guess, but I'm pretty certain about this guess, that the vast majority of the flow is that fixed flow. Ultimately, do these signals of the administrations, whether that they're going to be extremely punitive or less punitive, have impacts on those flows? Sure. But for the most part, it's probably not, again, really a reflection of the main problem, which is that, we have a broken immigration system that doesn't have any way to deal with this.
So as we talk about federal issues, the other piece here, in terms of what the governor had to say is that he was pretty critical. There's this whole issue that the governor raised in I think it's being charitable to say they were alarmist tones last week, because they were beyond alarmist, that, there were, people that had been released after being detained that, then tested positive for COVID. And so now there's been this sort of sideshow, or this new point of conflict between the Biden administration and the Abbott administration about who is going to pay for and administer COVID testing.
Man, I got to say, when you describe that, you get to the end goal right there, right? I mean, if you think about it now, you've got Greg Abbott, governor of the largest Republican state in the country, standing up to the new Biden administration in the first month on what issue? Immigration.
Yeah, well, that's
an issue that we've described as, I mean, one of the things that we always, we talk about Donald Trump, we say, when there was sort of more uncertainty about whether he would gain the nomination, it's whether he could even go on and be a viable candidate for the Republican Party. One of the things that was notable was his focus on immigration, because we said at the time, we'll say it still, this is one of the few issues that really can unify Republicans of all stripes. And so in a moment when everybody's talking about the divisions within the Republican Party, the fact that Abbott is making such a show of going out, talking about the issue that unites Republicans, and casting himself really in a lot of ways as standing up against the Biden administration, it's a pretty good look for the governor, especially, amongst his voters.
Right. And so, the politics of that, or the rhetoric that surrounds that, is pretty familiar. The governor made the point that immigration is a federal government responsibility, although hold that thought. And, as a result of that they should fund whoever does the testing. And then, he made an interesting rhetorical play there by saying that, the government, the Biden administration was avoiding having ICE do that. And then that then raises the notion that the Biden administration is going to be against enforcement, that they're going to be hostile towards ICE, which is the enforcement arm for these policies. And so there was there's an effort to set a very familiar partisan frame in the way that you're talking about. But the reason I said put a pin on that, because one of the other themes that the governor pursued at the press conference, and that, unless I'm wrong, the DPS spokesperson there and others at the press conference were quick to underline, is that the legislature, the Texas legislature, has been very proactive and generous in funding the border security program. So the DPS representative made sure to talk about how one of the aircraft and some of the vehicles they have that they're using to more effectively, quote unquote, secure the border. And they had a couple of props there in the background, I'm sure accidentally in the camera shot, had been paid for, very with the generous and attentive funding of the legislature. And Governor Abbott jumped in and basically reiterated the points, in the way that he clearly wanted to reinforce, which is that, he made the point that it's been very important that the legislature has provided $800 million in funding for the last, I think he said the last few sessions, and that this has been critical to the fight. Well, obviously, appropriations hearings are going on right now. The legislature is working on the budget. And it was just last week, I believe, that in a Senate appropriations hearing, one of the committee members made it clear that, that budget appropriation was not going to be reduced. Now, this is interesting because, in fact, DPS tried to get an increase in that budget 2 sessions ago and basically got pushed back by the legislature when they hit what seemed to me to be the magic symbolic mark of asking the legislature for $1 trillion.
There's $1 billion.
For $1 billion,
right,
to pass the 800 million to the billion point. And, it kind of opened it up for even some Republicans to say, you're asking for $1 billion.
Right.
And, you're not really showing us, what we're seeing is not a huge increase in border enforcement, but an increase in things like traffic citations in the border regions. And so, I think there's an interesting balance here between using the federal government and the national Democrats as a foil in the way you're talking about, but the fact that the legislative game and the budget process is very much afoot right now. And at the same time that the Texas state government wants to accuse the federal government of not fulfilling their responsibilities, they also want to justify continued border spending. Now, those two, that's actually an easier play now that there's a Democratic administration than it was when there was a Republican in the White House. But the messaging, you have two ideas in tension, right? Very close tension right there when you're, saying in one breath that this is the federal government should be taking care of all of this, but don't reduce our appropriations in the middle of the legislature making those kinds of decisions right now.
Well, and the interesting thing is, there's such clear context for this in the polling data. So, in the poll we just released, we were really interested in kind of setting the table for the legislative session before we, because at this point we don't really know what the specific legislation that they're going to look at is in a range of areas. So one of the things we did was we asked about spending in
right,
about, I think 9 different areas. So included areas like K through 12 public education, mental health services, health insurance for the uninsured, prisons and the penal system. I'm trying to think, what else was in there. But one of the other things in there was border security. And what's interesting among these 9 things that we asked about, and despite the history that you're outlining here, which is a couple sessions ago, DPS came and said, hey, could we get like another $800-900 million for the border? And they said, yeah, let's do it. And we tested that at the time, very popular among Republicans, not among Democrats, but they've continued to do this. Having said that, we asked people, does the Texas state government spend too much, too little, or the right amount in all of these areas? And unsurprisingly, Republicans, conservatives, did not say that the Texas was spending too little in any area except border security.
Right.
So border
The
security
only thing that moved the needle. Yeah.
Only thing that moved the needle. 61% of Republicans say the state, despite this, again, almost $1 billion investment that they've committed to over the last few sessions, is spending too little on border security. Less than a majority would say that about every other subject. And what's interesting about that, there's sort of 2 takeaways to that from my perspective. And one takeaway is, this is why, again, the politics of this are good. Talking about spending, even if it is a federal issue, even if Texas is a conservative state that balances its budget, this is a desire amongst Republican voters to make sure the state is spending enough money on border security. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation here, it doesn't seem to matter how much money they spend on border security. Now, maybe if they spend $1 billion and there were some headlines that said states spending $1 billion on border security, you might get a little bit of pushback. But at least as of right now, and despite the massive investments that the state has made in this, again, this federal responsibility of border security, setting blame aside, Republican voters don't seem to necessarily be saying, yeah, we've done enough. And this isn't to say we haven't seen this in other places. A few sessions ago, there was movement on gun laws. We tested, voters before the session on whether gun laws should be made more or less strict. Before the session, they wanted less strict, including Republican voters. After the session, a bunch of activity, had open carry, that kind of stuff. Share of Republican voters who wanted laws less strict significantly declined. It reflected the policy. Here, we're not seeing that. And I think that's partially because it's such first of all, it's just a persistent and salient topic, but it's also just kind of core to what it means to be a Republican, at least as far as I can tell in all the polling data we look at.
Yeah, this is going to be a little reductionist when I first say it, but I will qualify this. But, we wrote a piece in, I believe, the fall of 2015 about the surge of nativism defining the Republican Party and the run as Donald Trump's campaign was developing. And we were really looking in a lot of ways at the rise of this in Texas, in the trends that we're now talking about that were already apparent between 2010 and, if not a little earlier, but certainly between 2010 and 2015. I think there is an interesting dynamic here in which, in practical terms, as you said earlier, immigration and border security under most circumstances are great unifiers for Republicans. But it was that way before Trump. It was that way during Trump. We're now seeing that it's that way, at least post-Trump presidency. We can't push Trump completely out of the picture because he will not allow that per se. But, and I think in the current context, something that is, which is very different than 2015 in a couple of key ways, is that one of the other big pillars of Republican identity and ideology, and we talked about this, and public image, and even though I hate to say it, Republican branding is both, on one hand, immigration, border security, cultural identity. On the other hand, it's pro-business, good stewards of the political economy in Texas that we call the Texas model. Mm-hmm. The push for this at the moment, to go back to the redirection point, does seem to be part of a real concern that much of the public coverage and much of the outside view of Texas for the last month or two, if not a little longer, but certainly in the last month after the winter storm and the outages, has been WTF is going on in Texas, that they're having a winter storm. I was talking to somebody connected with the international business community just this morning who made it very clear that from the perspective of outside, that's really what people were wondering. If you're from a part of the world and you're thinking of investing in Texas, and you're from a part of the world that's above the tropics that deals with cold weather every year, you look at what happened in the last month and you're sort of scratching your head about the fact that hospitals in one of the major cities in the state, the major city in the state, in Houston, ran out of water.
Right.
I think that got subsumed in a lot of things for us on the ground here. I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which that is playing very large in the national eye, in which I think the Abbott administration and the leadership in the state are pretty painfully aware of that. And so I think there is a real powerful desire to direct attention away from that while the legislature is grappling with this. And along those lines, I mean, it's been an interesting morning in Texas communication because we saw the governor do this press conference and send the kind of messages we're talking about and direct attention to the failure of the federal government and that this is their responsibility, trying to do that not only on immigration and border security, but with this whole thing about testing at the intersection, ironically, of the pandemic and border security. Well, over in the Capitol, Speaker of the House Dave Phelan was on statewide radio this morning on the Texas Standard, the state NPR show produced here in Austin, gave a live interview for the Texas Standard in which, when asked about how the state was going to pay for the response to the power outages, he flagged it was going to be expensive. And, to his credit, talked about some of the policy responses that he's been promoting this week, including kind of a financial fund based on the model of water infrastructure that was implemented 7-8 years ago. Mm-hmm. But when asked how he was going to pay for it, said two things. Very, powerfully floated a trial balloon about using the rainy day fund, which I think we can just all assume now is probably going to happen.
Yep.
But second, what was the other source of funds? Federal money through the CARES Act.
Right.
So there's this continual kind of balancing of, playing the different polarities and different valences of Texas's relationship to the federal government that I think is just fascinating. And look, I don't want to, it's not that it's some do, particularly Democrats, and one might in some circumstances call this just base hypocrisy and move on. But I do think it is more complicated than that. And it can come off that way. But the structure of the budget and the structure of federalism in the United States and Texas's place in it is not going away.
Another layer on that I was thinking about as you were talking about it is, at a moment when both nationally and internationally, people are looking at Texas with, some derision, if you could say more derision than usual, whatever you want it to be. But there's a narrative about how, and at least nationally, I know the narrative has been, how could, this muscular, energy rich state that's, so certain of itself like Texas have this, this problem that we'd expect to see in, developing countries, not even in the United States, let alone in a place like Texas, right? And that's the narrative, right? And that's a problem.
Yeah. Certain disingenuousness in some of that criticism, but
well, yeah, but that's
it's not like it's not earned.
and that's the thing. I 100% agree. There's a certain amount of Schadenfreude. There's a certain amount of again, I didn't grow up in Texas. I know what people outside of Texas think about Texas. So there's a certain amount of that definitely going on here. The fact that there's sort of an international side of this too, and especially with respect to sort of businesses and all that kind of stuff, that's all problematic. But what I think another interesting layer in this, and thinking about the turn back to immigration and border security, on the one hand, a clearly contrarian pose to the federal government on the other, is it's a return to insularity, right? It's a return in some ways to us against everybody else. And you draw a line around the Texas border and say, you're on this side of the line or you're on that side of the line. And right now it's much more of a discussion. I think, and I think that's something you're talking about branding, but I think about this, you could say this is all disingenuous. I think a lot of Democrats will say this is purely Abbott trying to distract from, again, the storm, distract from COVID, et cetera. But I also say, and I feel like I'm always on here trying to give the governor the benefit of the doubt. And I'm just trying to give everybody the benefit of the doubt to some extent. But you look at these attitudes, this is what his Republican voters want, right? Again, 46% that immigration, border security, most important issue facing Texas. On an open-ended, 24% brought up immigration or border security is the most important issue that the Texas legislature should take on. That's twice the share that said COVID. 72% of Republicans say that undocumented immigrants currently living in the U.S., there's more than 10 million, more than 1.5 million in Texas, should be deported immediately. 40% agreed with that strongly. 75% of only 25% of Republicans said the state's increasing racial and ethnic diversity is a cause for optimism. 75% either said it was a cause for concern or they're not sure. The one area where this gets complicated, and I'm sure we should wrap this up soon, but the one area where this does get complicated is if the current surge that we're talking about is primarily made up of children. And that seems to be really what we're talking about here is these, it has to do with the way that we handle children when they cross the border, but also our ability even to house them all. Once you start talking about children and immigration, it does soften GOP responses. We saw that with the child separation crisis over, I guess that was 2 summers ago now. It was 2017.
Yeah.
It was 2-3 summers ago. But also, when we ask about DACA, the program that allows, people brought here as children through no fault of their own, who've gone to college or, gone to the military and basically can get citizenship. We ask about whether that program should be continued or ended. The share of Republicans who say that should be continued continues to increase. The share who say it should be ended continues to decline. So when we talk about children, it can get a little bit complicated. And that's kind of what I'm interested to see what the next step of this is. Because again, there's a natural punitive response and a natural prohibitionist response. But if we're talking about thousands of kids with no parents sitting in Texas, whether they're Texans or not, it's going to get a little bit more complicated to just go out and say, we need to get everybody out of here.
Well, I think that's right. But I think the governor telegraphed in his appearance today what direction they're going to go with that. And part of it is a play that we've seen before at the national level, which is to say that the presence of children is not necessarily about families, that we're seeing more children, we're seeing more unaccompanied children, and that this is a function of insufficient attention to the cartels and to criminal smuggling of children.
Right. It's not about children is the answer.
And well, I would tell what I was going to say. What I was going to say is that you can subsume this into the idea that this is a policy failure by the Biden administration. The Biden administration sent these signals. Everybody thinks it's the border is quote unquote open now. And so it's the Biden administration's fault that this is happening to children, and they're not taking care of the children once they're here. Texas state government, the Republican leadership was hamstrung or couldn't deploy that argument during the Trump administration, during the family situation, and during that humanitarian crisis. They will be able to deploy that this time. The governor laid the predicate for it today, and we can expect to see much more of that, unfortunately, because it is going to be a significant policy problem and a humanitarian crisis on the border. Again, the national coverage has said that the Biden administration is sort of desperately now searching to open facilities and find places to house them. These are not going to be probably significantly more humanitarian than the ones that we saw during the Trump administration, at least based on the indications we're seeing so far. That's going to be the challenge for the Biden administration going forward. And this time, unlike when that challenge is being faced by the previous administration, they'll be doing it under a barrage of withering criticism by Texas Republicans who were much less critical about this situation as it unfolded during the Trump administration. So we will continue to watch that. We'll, of course, have more polling on this as this unfolds. Jim Henson here. Thanks to Josh Blank for being here today. Thanks to the folks in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin for, as usual, technical and production support. Be well out there. You can find much of the data we talked about at the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.